Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Chin Dow of the Architecture Committee at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. The galleries are also open to the public, so please visit us at Gramercy Park South. From the Architecture Committee, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Following the conversation, there will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. Now to introduce our speaker. All right. First, Ambrose Aliaga-Kelly, AIA, Technical Director and Principal at Gensler. Ambrose is recognized for his knowledge of Manhattan's commercial office buildings and his ability to evaluate, optimize new and existing buildings with tenants in mind. For Related/Oxford Properties Hudson Yards development, Ambrose served as the voice of the tenant to ensure that the buildings were flexible, efficient, and attractive to prospective occupants. The success of projects, including the renovation of the Foreign Foundation building in New York and the new campus for the Clark Institute in Massachusetts, relied heavily on his skills and leadership. Ambrose participated in the review of IBC building codes for New York and is on the advisory board for high school construction trades, engineering, and architecture. He has also served on the AIA New York City Codes Committee. His award-winning projects have been featured in publications including Interior Design and Sustain magazine. Ambrose holds a bachelor's in architecture from the University College Dublin. And Madeline Burke-Vigeland, FAIA, Lead AP, NCARB, Principal at Gensler. Maddie has a broad portfolio of projects and reputation as a leader of successful collaborations with high-profile clients at peer design firms. In addition to her role as project director for the recently completed renovation of the iconic Ford Foundation, she was principal in charge for the expansion project for the Museum of Modern Art and served in similar capacity for the Vagelos Graduate and Medical Education Center at Columbia University, and most recently for the International Center of Photography at Essex Crossing. Maddie has worked closely with other institutions, including the Clark Institute, the New York Public Library, Jackie Robinson Foundation, and the New Museum. She serves as the chair of Dean's Council of the University of Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning and has lectured at the Pratt Institute, Columbia University, NYU, and Harvard. And with that, I now turn it over for the event. Without further ado, here is Ambrose and Madeline. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you so much, Chen. It's just great to be here. Ambrose and I are really privileged to have worked on this project. And so it's such a great story. We love sharing it. So we're very pleased that you asked us to do that. I am going to share my screen here. Great. So why don't we just dive in? We will start with a little bit of context. So in 1936, Henry Ford named his son Edsel as the first president of the newly formed Ford Foundation, set up to provide social services for those in need, largely in the greater Detroit region. In the early 60s, the foundation sought to expand its reach and become more international. It identified New York City as its new headquarters and hired the firm of Eero Saarinen, with Kevin Roche acting as lead designer. With Saarinen's untimely death, Roche and his partner John Dinkeloo formed a successor firm, bringing with them a handful of important projects, including the Ford Foundation headquarters. Kevin maintained a lifelong relationship with the foundation and with the building. He's seen here on the left with a model from the original project, and then on the right, shortly before the renovation.
The site's located on the east side of Manhattan between 43rd and 42nd Street, 2nd Avenue, and 1st Avenue, closer to 2nd Avenue. And you can see in the ground floor plan on the right, the primary entrance is from the north from 43rd Street with a porte cochere. And from the south, from 42nd Street, there's a secondary entrance through the garden into the building. There's a full story height site difference of 13 feet between the 42nd Street entrance and the 43rd Street entrance. The site was a mid-block site, and whereas it might have been possible for Kevin Roche to design a much larger building, the building was only sized to meet the requirements of the Ford Foundation, and there was a significant amount of zoning floor area that was unused. The solution normally for office buildings would be to locate a core in the center and have office space arrayed around the outside, but the Ford Foundation placed people first, and Kevin Roche's interpretation of that was to take the negative space that would have been the core in the middle and create a garden instead, so that the office space was provided with natural light on both sides. And then the southeast corner was eroded so that the garden had an aspect to 42nd Street and a direct connection to the city. So it's really a three-sided or two-sided building. And then on the top two floors, as you can see here, the shape is completed with two floors that provide amenities and convening space, whereas the first 9 floors are office space separated by a glass curtain wall from the 9-story atrium garden, with floors below grade for infrastructure and support. Kevin Roche wanted to keep the roof of the building clean, so all of the infrastructure you would normally see on the roof of a building is located in the below grade spaces.
Some early construction photos here. You really see that C shape. This is prior to the garden enclosure. And then here with the iconic skylight. And although it's a construction photo, there's a lot of debris still on the roof. As Ambrose mentioned, Kevin was very proud of keeping that roof free and clear of any specifically exposed mechanical systems. Kevin also worked with noted landscape architect Dan Kiley, whose brilliant and ambitious design matched with that of the architecture. Kiley called the garden an experiment. And this photo is from the original installation, showing the scale of the super large trees that were in the original installation. And here's the building upon opening, paired with an early Kevin Roche sketch from 42nd Street. The building was an immediate modernist sensation, and in the early 90s, the building exterior and the interior atrium were appropriately designated as New York City landmarks.
Photograph here on the left, right after the building was opened, and on the right as it was prior to the renovation project. And you can see there was very little change, if any, over those 50 or so, some years, except for the fact that considerable amount of development took place around the building, and the maturing of the trees in the adjacent park on the right all served to reduce the amount of natural light that was getting to the plantings within the garden and into the building itself. On the left, you can see the garden at opening, all of the planting kind of at the intended scale. And on the right, how we viewed it when we first arrived in the building prior to the renovation. A lot of overgrown vegetation, a lot of new species which had been introduced over time to replace the original plantings, and a lot of subsidence and countermeasures to deal with the sloping site and the vegetation on the sloping site. On the left, you can see the original atrium looking south and on the right, as it was prior to the renovation. The Corten steel, which is the dominant material on the inside, is a pre-weathered oxidized alloy of steel. And over the years, it had been subject to weathering, damage from water leaking, all of which we remedied during the renovation project. But all of these surfaces you see were preserved under the landmarks preservation. So all we were able to do was repair. We weren't allowed to make any significant physical change.
So a little on preservation and stewardship. In 2013, Darren Walker was installed as the president of the Ford Foundation. Darren would bring new life to Ford and evolve its mission, putting it, in his words, on the front lines of social change. Around this same time, Darren was notified of a building code that required all high-rise buildings to be fully sprinklered by 2019. For the headquarters building, this would honestly be a huge undertaking, especially given the presence of encapsulated asbestos. Where some owners would panic, Darren saw opportunity. Genser began working in earnest with Ford to identify the goals for the project. Ford saw themselves as stewards of the landmark building, and at the same time, recognized that they needed to look forward to the next 50 years. Preservation alone was not enough. The building renovation would need to embrace a more inclusive approach. The goal of a mission-driven building renewal was launched. Some photos here pre-reconstruction, highlighting the typical large office, single occupancy, encumbered by narrow and dark corridors. Also pre-reconstruction, the Dan Kiley designed garden with its very large trees proved to be a challenge. They were replaced over time with densely packed smaller trees, as you heard from Ambrose, and then the foliage was just everywhere, all over the place, very sort of overgrown. The Corten steel skylight was pitted, and there was a whole list of infrastructure issues that needed to be addressed.
So the facade restoration entailed repairs of a variety of different facade conditions that had largely been untouched for 50 years. This is a couple of typical details from the original drawings showing the typical curtain wall, very simple as it was in those days, but the detailing was very much inspired by the automobile industry. Kevin Roach and Saarinen office had been located near Detroit, and the technology that they developed for curtain walls in those days was very influenced by what was happening in the automobile industry.
Sorry.
The other dominant material is a Dakota granite that you see evident around the building. It was largely in good condition, but there had been water leaks and cracks that had to be repaired. You can see on the right some examples of surgical removals of pieces of damaged granite and replacement with similar colored stone. The quarry was still open, and we were able to source new stone from the original quarry and then match it around the building, depending on how exposed it had been to the elements over the years, and therefore to what degree it had changed in color and texture. This is a kind of holistic view of the garden looking towards the east. And you can see on the right the 9-story curtain wall that provides the garden wall. It was a single layer of glass, but the transoms in between at each story level conceal thin tube radiation that is used to provide heat to temper the environment within the garden in the winter. And this all had to be repaired and commissioned so that we could be sure that we could sustain the kind of plantings within the garden that Dan Kiley had originally intended, because over the years the degradation of that wall had led to a number of plantings not surviving because of extreme cold in the winter. the upper levels of the garden are actually open to the garden. You can see here on the left the upper 2 stories. We needed to maintain that openness, but because the garden was now considered an atrium under the current building codes, we were able to deploy fire shutters that would close these openings off in the event of an emergency, but otherwise they remained open as they had been within the original conception. So as Maddie mentioned, the introduction of sprinklers required by building codes and the removal of the asbestos triggered a whole number of upgrades within the building, and the major one of which was the transformation of the garden into an atrium as we understand it today in fire and life safety codes. At the same time, preserving the landmark quality of the space and not significantly changing any of the exterior surfaces. So the first concern was the glass curtain wall that separates office space from the garden would normally be a 2-hour rated separation in a new building or in a building per that code. We negotiated a number of things with the Department of Buildings, one of which was to provide a sprinkler coverage behind that glass at every level. And that was considered equal to a 2-hour separation, allowed us to maintain the existing curtain wall between office space and the garden unchanged. The second major modification was a smoke exhaust system in order to remove smoke that might gather in the atrium and in fire. We were able to do that by concealing fans at the upper level and introducing makeup air at the lower level. This diagram shows how we were able to conceal the fans at the top of the atrium. Again, Kevin Roach didn't want any mechanical equipment on the roof, and it was that had to be continued. So we were able to conceal in the topmost floor a section of the floor was dedicated to fan rooms with a little penthouse on the roof to exhaust, and then a section of curtain wall on the lowest level of the garden on the east side was made operable to introduce makeup air in the event of a smoke emergency. So the skylights over the garden atrium were a signature component of the landmark approval, so we had to maintain the quality of that piece of the building, but it had been subject to some pretty serious damage and wear and tear over the years. So we were able to renovate it incompletely. This is a section on the left from the original drawings, and on the right a picture of it as it is today. In order to repair it, essentially the whole assembly had to be taken apart and cleaned, regasketed, and then put back together, a very complicated jigsaw puzzle. But we were, in the end of the day, able to salvage, a significant percentage of the original metal components, albeit with new gaskets and flashings and separations that would ensure that it would endure for another 50 years and keep the water out. You can see some of the damage on the left where water had seeped in and transitions had failed. On the right, you can see a temporary floor structure that was suspended below it in order to allow for the renovation of the skylight to take place. On the right, you could see an image of it as it is today. What's interesting is at the very top of the facade, under the skylight, you can see a row of louvers, which was a very kind of innovative at its time component of the original mechanical system, where they actually recirculated air from the office space through the garden as a means of providing more fresh air as it was recirculated back into office space. So the restoration of the Corten steel was interesting because Corten, as I mentioned earlier, is a pre-weathered steel alloy, but over the years it had continued to weather and to different degrees in different areas of the building, some due to exterior, rain and weathering in the interior, in some places due to leaks, in some places due to just dust and dirt accumulation. So we were able to develop a process for repairs, and a way of restoring the color and texture of the Corten, but to its local color and texture, as opposed to trying to achieve a uniform singular finish throughout the building, because that's not the nature of how it was when we found it. On the left, you can see a section of floor that was removed to create a two-story gallery. What's interesting, though, is that you can see the steel beams have a series of openings within them, and this was how infrastructure was routed through the ceiling plenums, because the floor-to-floor height and the ceiling height allowed no space for running ductwork, piping, and electrical conduit other than through the beam structure. So all of these openings were our route for the renovation infrastructure. Unfortunately, as was mentioned earlier, the building was completely encapsulated in asbestos, so it wasn't possible to survey any of these openings. But we did have the original drawings from the Ford Foundation's archive of the building, both for steel and for mechanical systems. And we were able to use those original documents to kind of reconstruct the paths for infrastructure, rework those into our model for the design of the building, and write the infrastructure in 3D. And then once the demolition and abatement was complete, we were able to go in and verify that by and large most of the openings were where we had hoped they would be. This is a view of the 43rd Street entrance after renovation. Another signature material was the brick paving, which over the years had been coated and sealed with a number of different products that we had to strip down. We had to carefully salvage any brick that we found in the building during demolition so that we could reuse it. And again, try locally to match what was ever adjacent to the areas we were patching. Another view of the same area, you can see the brick in both locations. On the left, a view of the 42nd Street entrance and the stairs that take you up through the garden to the main entrance. On the right, the entrance after you come in from 43rd Street, looking towards the reception and elevator lobby ultimately that takes you up through the building. So the restoration of the garden involved initially the complete removal of all the original planting and the soil, because it had been contaminated during the asbestos abatement. Here you can see some images from the original drawings of the curtain wall, a slight variation on what we saw in the earlier drawings of the office curtain wall, but a similar technology. Everything on the building was organized on a roofless 6-foot module. So we took that as our guiding principle in planning for the renovations in the new office space. This is a couple of images of the section of curtain wall on the lowest section of the east side, where we took existing fixed glass panels out and replaced them with operable panels that provide makeup air for the atrium smoke exhaust system.
And here we have a few sections through the garden. On the top, the diagram shows Kylie's original intent for the garden. It was this layered effect, as you've been hearing, and the ability for transparency below those very large trees. The middle diagram shows the condition pre-renovation, where the replacement plants took on this density of you really could no longer see beneath that, and they more or less blocked the views through the garden. Working with Raymond Jungles, landscape architect, The new design restored the intent of Aliaga-Kelly. And so the idea is to recreate that transparency through the understory of the trees. We replace not this exact species of trees, but rather the intent. The water feature was also a key focal point of Kelly's terrace design. But by the time of renovation, its pure form had been more or less contaminated, we'll call it, with a fountain. The idea, we think, behind the fountain was to prevent the stagnation of the water. And so in the renovation, we restored this pure form intent with the idea of two small weirs at either side so that they create this movement of water, which is very subtle, but it also creates a wonderful sound as one ambulates through the garden. These are some photos from the recent renovation, and as you've been hearing about asbestos, so due to the condition of the soils and all the renovation that was going on, everything needed to be removed. And the team worked with Ford, obviously, and with the the New York Botanical Garden to find homes for any trees and plants that were still living. Some were given to the neighborhood, and then all the soils were properly disposed of. The new design seen here, now you can see this lacy effect of the garden, back to the Kelly original idea. Convening. As we dug into the interior planning, it became clear that if the foundation was going to carry out its expanded program mission, it needed to open up and provide more space for public convening, specifically with like-minded organizations. The 1968 section on the left shows a building largely occupied by corporate office spaces, as seen in teal. And while the garden was designed as a public space, it was closed to the public on a regular basis after 9/11. The orange spaces on the left were largely used for Ford convening and specifically invited guests. The current section on the right now provides for a 50% increase in convening spaces, now all open to like-minded organizations. In addition, the purple spaces are given over to office space for like-minded organizations, and Ford's office space, which previously took up 10 floors in the teal, now takes up 6 floors in the teal on the right. Visitors entering the main entrance on 43rd Street are now greeted immediately with access to a welcome lounge with clear views right through the atrium and to 42nd Street. This area, prior to the renovation, was occupied by facilities offices, hard surface gypsum board walls with no view into or through the garden at this area for visitors. The social justice mission is immediately on view as one enters the building. The main reception space and its welcoming portrait by Kehinde Wiley leads visitors to the foundation's new gallery, all publicly accessible. Here's the lower level convening spaces, access from the lower level of the garden. Ford's art collection is also on view in areas throughout the building. The previous art collection, dominated by European male artists, was deaccessioned with the board's approval to enable a collection which better reflected Ford's social justice mission. As Ambrose mentioned, the renovations involved stripping the interior rooms back to the core elements. And in this case, the auditorium, we needed to put it back together again as if no one had touched it. The space is a total tribute to mid-century modernism. And our proposed update, are ultimately realized, visually adhered to the original design and at the same time seamlessly integrates accessible lifts, audiovisual aids, and flat surface removable seating. In the seats, as we were going through the evaluation of the building, we noticed these pivoting mechanisms on the underside of the arms of the chairs. These turned out to be cigar holders for the previous occupants. So suffice to say, we did keep them for historic purposes, but they're no longer allowed for cigar use. Warren Plattner was the interior designer working at the time in the Saarinen Roche Dinkeloo office. Some more photos here on the upper level convening spaces. Again, previously private offices were on this space for the executives. And here's an example of a smaller convening room utilizing repurposed furniture that came from the private offices and light fixtures repurposed from what was in the, again, private office space, now given over to convening. Brand and mission are boldly on view here. This is the 10th floor, formerly Ford executive offices, now given over to nonprofit space for convening. As a Center for Social Justice, all of the non-office spaces, including meeting rooms, the auditorium, the garden, the gallery, they're all available free of charge for nonprofits with a like-minded mission to Ford. Gensler was also the designer for the brand and graphic design, which embeds the mission and legacy in every message. So the workplace. Equipped with Darren's mandate of a collaborative workplace, we work with the Ford team to come up with a workplace model that better represented their organization. Seen on the left, typical double-loaded corridors and individualized offices. On the right, we landed at a workplace which is open and non-hierarchical, providing closed collaborative spaces in the wings shown in green, and allowing clear transparency through all facades of the building, bringing shared daylight for all. Slide on the left showing the before corridor, and on the right showing daylight for all. The design team proposed lighting components within the housing of the original decorative pendant fixtures. We work with Fisher Moran Stone, lighting consultant. This artfully extended their life and legacy. And as much as possible, the original Plattner selected furniture would be restored, stripping back the wood to its original stain, reconditioning leathers, but also making adjustments to height in order to accommodate a more universal and inclusive ergonomic. Here's a view here across the atrium, picturing the restored legacy furniture repurposed from the private offices and now for collaboration within the open workplace. All of these pieces were previously found in the private offices. Here's a typical arrival corridor with open views all along the atrium. This is looking out on the left to 42nd Street. And this gives you an idea of the full transparency through the building. When it snows, we call it a snow globe. You really feel like you're in the middle of a snow globe. And here, just a picture of the workplace. You just get this intensity of the urbanness of New York City as you're sitting looking out at all these amazing buildings.
So from the application of accessibility and inclusion to the existing components of the building resulted in a series of modifications that we had to work closely with landmarks on. For example, the 6-foot module that the building is ruthlessly organized on, allowed for pairs of doors that unfortunately didn't meet today's requirements for clearances for wheelchair access. So wherever we had pairs of doors in 6-foot openings on the upper line, you can see the renovation resulted in a single wider door with a fixed side light, but everything was designed to replicate the look and feel of the original doors, albeit with wider, more generous sizing. Within the garden itself, because it's a terraced garden with a 13-foot difference in elevation from 43rd to 42nd Street, there was very little accessibility to components of the garden for someone who is disabled. Through the renovation, we were able to increase that by 58%. On the right, you can see in yellow where we modified existing paths. We created a new path along the south facade, concealed a wheelchair lift behind a large granite pier that provided access to a new path on the east and north side, where we were able to replace stairs with ramps and sloped surfaces to provide accessible access to all kind of three sides of the garden, to provide vistas and access where it hadn't been possible previously. These sections show some of that gradient difference and how it's challenging to provide access. And again, that the garden was part of the landmarks preservation, so all of the modifications and adjustments had to be negotiated with landmarks. And whereas it wasn't possible to provide full accessibility, this became generally agreed as a happy medium. This view along the south facade shows where the wheelchair lift was concealed to look like a component of the curtain wall. Signage and branding within the garden helped to kind of guide people. The garden, of course, is open to the public, and the 42nd Street entrance is open during the day for people to come in and use and experience the garden. And on the right is a sample of the new signage. One component that is new is a sensory garden that was added at the east side of the garden. Signage at the entrance telling the story of the building and then a history of the building, and pathways, marked and indicated in a way that allowed them to be clear yet subtle and not overtly obvious, whereas there hadn't been really signage in the garden previously, so it had to be done tastefully. And this is a view of the new gallery that was created adjacent to the main entrance on the first floor. A 2-story volume was carved out. This is a gallery open to the public with changing exhibits. And on the right, the entrance into the gallery from the corridor off reception. Maddie mentioned earlier that the branding was all introduced throughout the building to kind of reinforce the mission of the Ford Foundation, and emphasize, the belief structure underlying the foundation and its principles, and yet woven into the architecture in a way that seemed natural. So in terms of sustainability and resilience, of course, the most resilient thing you can do when you're doing a renovation like this is to maintain as much of the existing structure as is possible. So that we were able to do because the guidelines of the landmark approval meant that we could only restore and not really replace. So we were able to achieve LEED Platinum certification. There was great emphasis on reuse and recycling of whatever we removed from the building that could be reused. Energy use was reduced significantly. All of the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing infrastructure within the building was replaced, which all resulted in huge leaps in terms of efficiency. All the lighting was 1960s era fluorescent and replaced with our current technology with a significant drop in energy consumption. As Maddie mentioned, a lot of furniture and millwork was reused and repurposed and reinstalled in the building. And the curtain wall was largely kept intact, albeit areas where glass was removed and regasketed and reinstalled. Glass had been cleaned where it hadn't been cleaned over the years, but everything that was removed by and large was restored and reinstalled.
So we've given you a lot of information here. We thought we'd close this part of the talk with just some completed photography, just to let you absorb it all, kind of a tour, a virtual tour.
Maddie and Ambrose, do you mind while the images show if we start our Q&A session?
Go ahead. And
Be a good time for that?
Yeah, I can click through quicker.
No, it's fine. It's fine. You can even continue to show them.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much. The National Arts Club Architecture Committee had been meaning to do a program on this building for quite some time. I've never actually been to it or inside of it. But I know that so many people had said it was so great and that the renovations were ongoing that we needed to do it. So thank you and amazing job. First question, really your dedication to detail and every aspect of this, from facade to the furniture, is amazing. I feel like even the signage icons are sort of 60s retro, and I'm ready for Don Draper to just walk the door, throw down his hat and spark up a cigarette. But I do have a technical question before we get into the public's questions. So, since this is landmarked, as well as sort of being beholden to certain details, were you able to make upgrades, for instance, like in glazing, in terms of like making it double or triple glazed? I noticed in the details you showed they were single glazed, like plate glass.
So we did investigate that. The facade was landmarked, so changing the facade from single glazed to double glazed would have resulted in a significant visual change to the building. So there was great resistance to doing that. We studied the facade in terms of the energy performance of the facade, which is obviously a single glazed facade wouldn't perform quite as well as a double glazed facade, but the nature of the savings in energy that we were able to find elsewhere in the renovation in terms of mechanical systems, electrical systems, the new materials were such that our kind of carbon footprint was greatly reduced, and the amount of energy that would then have been saved by going to a double glazed facade wouldn't have warranted the expense. So it was considered, it was studied, but for those reasons, we didn't proceed in that direction.
I think the payback period was like 250 years or something like this.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Huge.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I guess since the atrium itself is not necessarily occupied, you might say occupied office space, makes sense. You wouldn't necessarily want to regulate it so much as like an office space.
Right. And it's interesting that the atrium does in a way provide a double glazed
Mhm.
facade to the office space, at least on one side, by providing that kind of buffer space.
The double glazing is the space between the office. Interesting.
With a big airspace, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interstitial space between.
Right, right.
All right, we have some great questions from our viewing audience. During the renovations, where did the employees work?
Well, that was a really interesting, it's a very good question. So because basically the building was completely taken apart, the decision was made to go to swing space. And what was the biggest decision in that was to take everyone out of the private office and put them into a space. In fact, it was a space not too far away, but it was Google's first space when they came to New York. And so you can imagine it was very, very different from what the Ford Foundation building was. But the idea was to start getting the employees acclimated to a very different way of working. And what they found was that this idea that all of a sudden people were so close together and so connecting with each other, it did have a kind of a stair, a three-story stair in the space. And that it really, it sparked, I think, this openness, this idea that they could work outside of their, previous mentality, which was basically 80% private offices.
Great. Is the atrium space open to the general public?
It is. In fact, it just reopened. I believe it's still 6 days a week, but you should check Ford's website, as well as the gallery is also open and free to the public. It is just an incredible amenity for the city, for everyone in the city. But just check the hours, because I think I'm just not current on those since the pandemic. And it's, as much as we show these photographs and as beautiful as the photography is, there is nothing like being there. It is just an incredible building.
I can't wait to see it. Has the building ever been used by filmmakers?
That's a really good question. I do not know. Ambrose, do you know?
I haven't heard of it ever being used for a film.
Yeah, other than Ford's own films, they do a lot of stuff. They do a lot of filming with their grantees and things like that. So I have seen people filming in the space, but I'm not aware of commercial firms, commercial filmmakers using it. I kind of feel like they probably wouldn't allow that.
Yeah, it's funny. It seems like an ideal place for it. All right. Well, how long did the renovations take?
Well, Ambrose and I first went there I think all told, it took about 5 years, maybe a little bit longer in terms of the whole process. Our initial meeting there was a due diligence. It was related to the sprinkler conversation. And as we showed you, the more and more we dug into the building and realized what the nature of the renovation was going to take, the project just, the team building the team was a really, really important part of the project. The actual construction took a little over 2 years, the actual construction itself, and that's the period that the Ford staff moved out. So they didn't move out for the full 5 years. They moved out for roughly 2 years.
Right. We didn't see it for sure. I didn't note it, but is there any seating in the garden?
You can sit in the garden. There is not, it's specifically not, there's a sort of bench structure, and you know, you can sit along the way there, but there's no, unless there's an event going on, there's no chair seating. Ambrose, you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think on the east side of the garden, where what we mentioned earlier, the sensory garden is, there's a low stone wall that's pretty much at seated height, and that would probably be the only surface that would offer somewhere to sit.
Unless you're just sitting on the steps.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Which people do.
Building outside
Yeah,
or something.
definitely. And it
I
is,
think this is
sorry, it is an incredible, it's also an incredible event space. And again, nonprofits with like-minded institutions, organizations are allowed to, there's the whole point of this as a Center for Social Justice is that one can go on the web and reserve, you know, an evening here, or reserve a day, or reserve a conference room, small, big, or super large kind of thing. The only thing they charge for is for refreshments, but everything, you know, they don't charge for room rental or anything like that. What an amenity in New York, right?
That's great. That actually is a good segue for this next question. How does the public know that the spaces are for the public?
Well, it is all over their website. It is written on the building. It's a public garden, you know, open X days a week. And I think by word of mouth, they had a art opening there. Their first art opening, the line was truly around the block. They just had their first art gallery opening to the public since the pandemic this past week, and they had, I think, over 300-400 people there. So you know, the word is out there. I think you know, organizations like yours that sponsor talks like this, we can spread the word, but it is something that is just, it's such an important place for New York. Really, it is a gift, as Michael Kimmelman said.
Yeah. I think we have a similar thing at the Arts Club. A lot of people just don't realize that the gallery is always open. You know, it's the same, you know, there's a public portion and a private portion. Our mission is to educate in the arts, you know, the arts. It's something we're constantly having to sort of remind ourselves and everybody that we're open and we're a nonprofit. All right. To what extent is what you learned through the incredible restoration upgrade project applicable to other modernist buildings in similar need?
Ambrose, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've actually, you know, within our firm, we've had a lot of conversations with our colleagues in other offices who are beginning projects in similar 20th century, you know, structures that are either preserved or regarded as signature modernist structures. So it has been helpful to kind of show them the project, walk them through the steps that we took, and help them understand, you know, the nature of what it entails to do something like this. So I think there are definite lessons to be learned. I mean, we've learned an enormous amount especially about the materials that we work with. You know, the Corten steel is such an unusual material. It's not something you come across in a lot of buildings. It was something that Saarinen office and Kevin Roach used on other structures. But we kind of unearthed a whole series of very expert subcontractors who worked with us on the project to help, you know, kind of nurture these materials back to their former glory. And they're terrific resources that we've used on other projects subsequently.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, as we said at the beginning, this building it's such a gift. I mean, just the original building itself. There was a concern from a lot of people, as you can imagine, certainly in the industry, but but in all industries and organizations, that, you know, this renovation was going to ruin the building. And I think that, you know, what we learned is that, you know, you have to examine every aspect. And some aspects, you know, quite frankly, we had to push, whether it was with other organizations. You know, there was a lot of pushback, quite frankly, on the doors and changing of the doors. So I think the idea of standing up for accessibility, that works, that ultimately, you know, I don't think most people know that we changed the doors in order to accommodate accessibility there. And so I think really standing by our convictions in terms of what's important. You know, you mentioned the furniture and stuff. Again, we were blessed with just an amazing collection of furniture. And so really examining what we had and what we could do, but also, you know, the heights of the tables, the heights of the seating, that was changed. You know, in many other instances, somebody might say, well, it doesn't really meet accessibility. Let's just get rid of it and get the new stuff. So I think it was those kinds of conversations of every step along the way, asking what's important for this building, what works, and what do we have to change. And I think, you know, I think that's a really good lesson for any existing building renovation.
Yeah, that's really great. I wanted to ask, that section perspective that you showed in the beginning is so beautiful, and it describes the building perfectly, explains the whole thing. Was that from the original architects, or did Gensler do that?
No, that's from the original Roche, which is so amazing. So, you know, Kevin had this idea about this transparency within the city. I think, you know, what he was working with at the time was, you know, the norm was this was an executive office space. His design was brilliant and remains brilliant. We just were able to, I think, take his intent. Along the way, you know, we asked ourselves at every meeting, you know, what would Kevin do? And as Ambrose said, you know, we stuck to his 6-foot module, but the bigger thing was, you know, what Kevin was thinking, what Dan Kiley was thinking, what John Dinkley was thinking, and trying to channel that to 21st century mission-driven renovation or transformation.
Yeah, you did such an amazing job. Some more questions since we have time. What was your experience with landmarks, better or worse, as it was an unusual modern building?
I'll speak up here. I have to say Landmarks was absolutely extraordinary. They were such a partner, and they were in fact the organization that we went to first when this project came up. And we said, you know, we've got something really important here. We'd like to meet with you. And they came to the building and we met and we talked about it. And Ambrose, why don't you talk a little bit about the approach? You know, you always talk about equivalency and what we could give them and what we couldn't give them.
Yeah, I mean, it was, we were able to always have, you know, very kind of positive negotiations with them. And I think we had a very similar reception at the New York Department of Buildings. They were very enthusiastic about the project and what we were able to do to take this building and bring it up to current codes, make it safer, but yet preserve it. They all knew the building. You know, there are a lot of architects still at the Department of Buildings, and they knew the building. They'd watched the building as they had grown in the city. So we had, you know, very good relations with all of the officials at the city, including the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, who we had a number of discussions with as part of the negotiation on accessibility increases, and they were all really partners on the project as opposed to adversaries as they can be in some instances.
And the fire department too. So it was all these organizations, and we going to them early, I think, was really key to the project. And you know, we'd go to one and they'd say, well, what did fire department say? What did Landmark say? And So we were kind of negotiating across these platforms. But as Ambrose said, they all really wanted to make the project work. And I think that, just throughout the whole process, but Landmarks especially, partnered, any small change we needed to make, we would run it by them, and they would, identify whether or not this was a public process change or administrative change. And I think they respected the fact that we came to them early on. That was really important.
I'll just add in here real quick. Somebody was nice enough to put the times that are open here. The garden is open Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. and on Saturdays, 11 to 6. And we'll close early at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, June 1, and 3 p.m. on Friday, June 6. So somebody who, but also, I think you said that any nonprofit can use this specifically that are closing early.
Yeah, in fact, there was just an article in the Times on the garden, on the garden, and what, how they took care of it during the pandemic.
Oh, that's great. Steve says, when I first visited the building many years ago, when entering from 42nd Street, my first impression was the humidity in the atrium. Has that changed?
Yes. So one of the big changes from the mechanical system was that I mentioned the louvers at the top of the atrium, where they used to commingle air from the office space and the garden. So they had to be separated. So you had a separate system for the garden, a separate system for the office space, which actually benefited both. As a result, the office space could be conditioned and tuned appropriately for office space and to preserve the art collection. And then the garden could be augmented to better sustain the plantings. So we needed a certain amount of humidity, but we didn't want too much. We had a wonderful landscape consultant, Raymond Jungles, who worked with us. And so achieving the right levels of temperature and humidity throughout the year was something we worked with them and JB&B, who were the engineers. And we did a number of CFD studies to understand how temperature and humidity in the garden could be maintained at various times during the year to support the plantings.
Just add also about the plantings, we had mentioned that the Kylie garden was an experiment, and the trees didn't make it because of the conditioning in the garden. They were these huge trees. And so one of the things that was done was that the large trees specifically were planted in the condition of a slope that they would be in the garden, because some of the slopes are quite steep. And then they were then brought in, and they're in it's called the Missouri or the Louisiana method. I can't remember what it is right now, but it's a all wrapped tree so that it took root in the shape of the soil that it was going to be placed in. It's quite beautiful.
Beautiful. A technical question: what was the size of the Gensler design and technical team that worked on it, including actual construction workers?
Yeah, so we did have a big team. I would say that our core team at its peak was probably about we'll say 15 to 20 people. We had tremendous consultants working with us. JB&B were the engineers. Thornton Tomasetti were the structural engineers. Fantastic contractor, Hennigan Construction. Fabulous subcontract. I mean, we had a wonderful, beautiful client. We had a wonderful, beautiful building, and we had a team of people, consultants, contractors, everyone that believed in this building. And so everybody, from the get-go, when the subcontractors were brought on board, the architects and the owner gave them the story of this mission-driven project so that everybody could buy into and work together towards the transformation. It wasn't just, I don't want to say just another building renovation, but it was a very, very special mission that needed to be accomplished as a part of the renovation. And I think that worked.
It seems like buildings that are I heard a quote about it a long time ago, but like a beloved building will, get its maintenance ultimately, and people will contribute to it, whereas, you know, um, an ugly building might not get the same sort of attention.
Right, and it's about the soul, right? It's not necessarily, but in this case, it is a beautiful building. But I think this building has soul, and I think that everybody latched onto that.
That's really nice. How often do the exhibits change in the?
It's about, I think it's about probably about 3 or 4 a year. And along with the exhibits, they have fantastic programs. They had a terrific, all through the pandemic, they carried out their arts programming, and very, very hands-on. The social justice mission of this gallery is really just incredible. So the stories out of the gallery are quite beautiful as well. And when as I mentioned, as you're in the building, in addition to the gallery, you get to see the Ford collection too, which is pretty cool, including a JR installed mural and lots of beautiful installations that were just for the building.
Okay. What about Saarinen's role in design?
Well, the building was kind of they won the competition while Kevin Roach was still at Saarinen's office, but then Saarinen's demise came very early, and Kevin kind of inherited the project. It's interesting, all of the drawings, even though they were it was Kevin Roach's firm at the time, all the drawings have the Eero Saarinen title block on them. So they were still kind of transitioning from Eero Saarinen's practice to the Kevin Roach's, or Roach Dinkaloo as it was called. And at the same time, during the construction of this building, they were also working on the St. Louis Arch and the Dulles airport terminal. So there was a lot of other very, kind of incredible projects happening at the same time. And then the office moved from Michigan to Connecticut, which is where they ultimately landed for the latter part of the project, and where they remain today.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, who knows, might have been different. Do you think you affected how Landmark office staff perceive their own mission through working on this project?
Sorry, could you ask that again? Add the question again?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry. Do you think you affected how Landmarks perceives their role in these projects?
I guess we'd like to think that. I mean, but I think that my experience, our experience with Landmarks, has been, very strong belief that you need a partner, and we're not always going to agree on every aspect, but I think that they respected the fact that we had a tough project. This was a difficult landmark for so many reasons, but in this case, I think what helped the arguments was the mission-driven aspect of it. So that Ambrose talked about the lift in the garden, the elevator in the garden. I don't know, getting that through wasn't easy, actually. And so they respected the fact how we integrated it with the architecture itself. So yeah, I think it was just about partnering. Yeah.
And I think I would add and say that, the intersection between preservation, accessibility, life safety, and kind of the emerging power of energy codes and sustainability in projects, and how they intersect with the landmarks process, is something that keeps evolving, and something that was kind of a moving discussion as part of this project.
That's great. I think we're out of time, and I have one more question that I will end off on because it's a little bit long, but I think it speaks to the program that we're doing. This comes from Alexis Alvarez. It's really not a question, but a comment. He says, I worked at the foundation as a research associate in the urban poverty program in the mid to late 80s when Frank Thomas was the foundation's president. My office was on the 6th floor, this office on the right, 43rd Street side. Being an architecture buff, I think that although I was thrilled to be working there, I was much more thrilled that I was working in the building. The HVAC system didn't work very well. It was always much too warm in the summer and too cold in the winter. I do hope that's been fixed. I think that's a question. And he ends off by saying it remains one of my 2 favorite buildings in NYC, along with the Chrysler building.
Nice. Yeah. No, that was, he was not the only one to complain about the heating. And no, all those systems were completely redone, completely. You know, there was just so much going on in terms of the offices, as Ambrose mentioned, the connectivity between the atrium air and the office air. So those systems now are specifically separate because of the new building atrium requirements, or the idea that this was now an atrium. One thing I think we didn't mention actually was that it's thought that after the design of this building, that's when modern day atrium requirements came as a result of this particular building and other buildings like it. So it was not only the units at the perimeter, but the idea of this mixing of air that also, I think, caused some of the issues, some of the problems.
I think we've had 2 programs that I think in some loose way relate. One was the renovation of the UN campus, which that has similar issues. But oddly enough, I think the other program that somewhat similar to this was a Crystal Palaces program by Francis Maroney, because in a way, this is sort of a modern Crystal Palace. Big glass atrium has got its own issues, and really those, the Crystal Palace was meant as a sort of a growth out of a greenhouse, and this is kind of a greenhouse as well. You're in this intersection of modernism and a sort of element that worked really well. And with that, I'll end off and thank you again so much. We can't wait to go visit the space, and I hope that everybody else will as well.
Great. I hope you can all see the building. It really is very special. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this program. It was amazing.
Take care.
You too. Bye, guys.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.